Hello and welcome, fellow bookworms and film fans. Welcome to this week's episode of The Consented Narrative, where we will be looking at Trainspotting by Irvine Welsh. It was published in 1993 and then it was adapted to screen in 1996. Now, as usual, I'll be looking at four things. How good is the film? How good is the book? Of course, how good is the plot from the book to the film? And overall, how well does the film take from the book? So, first things first, the film. Now, this film is an honest, representation of an honest look at addiction, and how some mates might not be the best for you, but because you've known them all your life, you kind of stick with them, even maybe if you shouldn't. I thought it was brilliantly represented, and apart from two scenes that I cannot watch, which, I will end up sort of like gagging or ended up throwing up, to be perfectly honest, and you'll find out those two scenes later on when I discuss the plot. It was just a good all-round film, to be fair. And as I said, it deals with a very hard look at addiction. And you've got one person that's, constantly getting himself off the gear, then back on it, then back off it. You've got one that stays clean until something bad happens in his life, and then he ends up on the gear, and that causes, unfortunately, his death. Then you've got another one that the gear just doesn't affect at all. You've got one that never touches heroin, and it's a look at all these addictions and a look at who it is that you surround in your life as to, what you'll end up doing basically with it. You see the actual struggles from a human standpoint as well, and you see how easy it is to slip into a downward slope. And sometimes, you don't come back from it. Sometimes you don't survive the downward slope, and sometimes you do. Tommy didn't, unfortunately, survive the downward slope, but Renton does, and he gets himself back off the gear. The acting is honestly superb. It is a fantastic film. If you have a weak constitution, maybe don't watch it. Or as I discuss the plot, as I said, maybe with those two scenes, you just leave the room or close your eyes or whistle or whatever. But honestly, the light that they're shining on the heroin situation, and the fact that they're not making it seem like it's a great thing to be on drugs, they're looking at how it does destroy lives. I think it's, it's fantastically done. This film does get a 7 out of 10 for me. Now, the book. Now, a few of my friends already know because I have sent pages to them. It's just, let's have a look. Yeah, so it was a hard read, and it honestly was, and it's because it was written in the dialect of sort of like the Scottish characters that it was portraying, so it was giving them a real voice, and I loved that it was giving them a real voice, but it would take me a while to get into the flow of the storyline. And I think, I'm finally starting to read it in English. I'm finally starting to understand, the phrases and everything like that. And, the effing and jeffing I kind of just sort of like put to one side, and I was like, this is how they talk. I mean, I swear in general life, it's so hard not to. You just end up saying, it just slips out. And so that wasn't even a problem. But then every now and then there'd be like a really Scottish phrase and it would just completely take me out, and I'd have to like Google Translate or something. So it's just sort of like you sat there going, okay, right, let's see. And so then, I'd have to try and get myself back into the story. But once you understood the story, once you understood, what they were saying, and once you got into the flow of it, it was very good. And it is very well written. The characters are believable characters as well. And you could see the flaws in each of them, and you could see that there was no prettying up what they were doing. Begbie has anger issues. Spud deals with addiction issues and thievery and ends up in and out of prison. Renton deals with his own sort of like flaws. You can see these in the characteristics, and there wasn't any prettying up of what they were. And as I said, the language did feel more conversational than intended to offend. I would probably reread this book a couple years down the line. It would be one that I'd have to go, right, I'm in the mood for this, because it's not one that I can just pick up and read as and when I like, because it will take me a while to get into the flow of it. But honestly, if you can get past the dialect, I would recommend this story, because it's about real people dealing with real addictions, not just drugs, but there's also a lot about, alcohol abuse and everything like that, and honestly, the time period that they struggle with it. So I would give the book a 6 out of 10. Now, the plot. Now, first things first, I do apologise if the plot is a bit out of whack, as I did struggle to, as I said, to understand some of the parts. So I will try and, I will try my hardest, but if there are bits that I've missed or if there are bits that are completely wrong, please leave it below in the comments. You know, I'm honestly open to that. So anyway, film starts with Renton and Spud running away from the police and Renton narrating the entire book. Sorry, the entire film. The book is from several viewpoints, so you get the narration from Spud and Begbie and Renton and Sick Boy and, you know, a number of characters. But the book starts with Renton and Sick Boy going to find some skag, as they call it, or heroin, as we normally know it. Then in both, Renton goes up, shooting up, and then after a bit, he gets clean. And he's just like, nah, I'm done with it now. And this is the first time of quite a few times that he ends up getting clean and then, you know, going back on it. In both, it goes through what he needs to get clean and how he intends to lock himself away with everything that he needs. He locks the door. He goes off to get one final high from someone. And then at this stage in the film, there's a little bit as we get a brief introduction to Spud, Sick Boy, Begbie, and Tommy. And Renton, you know, who are the main guys. You don't really get this in the book. You just kind of are introduced to them as and when. You don't really get this sort of like, this is Tommy, this is Begbie. You even kind of see the girls for a bit. Anyway, so to help him get off the heroin, he gets some suppositories, which means you stick it up, that apparently will release a slow high to help him get off heroin. Then his bowels kick in and he needs to let loose and quick. He then realises the pills that he has stuck up there have now come out in this putrid sort of like toilet bowl. And this is the first scene I cannot watch in the film. He basically, just even thinking about it makes me feel a bit sick. He starts digging around to find the suppositories, and I'm going to leave it there. So in the book, as I said, we get other people narrating. So we're getting other viewpoints in the book as well, and it kind of, we can then see Renton's character from other people's perspective as well as just his own. Now in the film, Renton has borrowed a homemade sex tape from Tommy by pretending he was borrowing a football video. And we'll find out later why that's a really horrific move on his part. I mean, obviously you don't like steal your friend's sex tapes. I don't know how many of you have sex tapes, not even gonna, let's just get past that. So in the film as well, there's a scene quite early on where we learn how crazy Begbie really is, as he starts a bar fight for some unknown reason. He literally just throws a pint glass over the back of his head, it hits somebody, and he's like, yeah! And you learn a lot in the book and in the film of just like, there is something not right with him. He is not okay. And you get this scene, but you get this a lot later in the book, this sort of like bar fight. And we also get a scene in a nightclub as well in the film, where it looks like everyone's going to get some, except Renton's girl that he ends up with, that he picks up at a club, by the way, and you have to be, you know, over 18 to be drinking in a club, is actually still at school and is 14 years of age. Which he doesn't realise, and he kind of sits there and goes, oh. And then she kind of blackmails him into being into like a pseudo relationship with it. It makes no sense. I feel sorry for Renton. But then we get as well, sort of like, so that evening, Renton ends up with the underage girl. Tommy is about to get some, and then his girl realises that he's lost the sex tape. They originally think he's put it back at the video store. So then she eventually leaves Tommy because he can't find this sex tape. Spud is gonna get some with his girlfriend, but unfortunately falls asleep before he's able to perform. Sick Boy goes off and whatever, and so does Begbie. Now, in both, after sort of like this, you know, we get this scene, and it's a horrible bit where the baby in the local heroin dealer's house has unfortunately passed away. And we learn that that's Sick Boy's little girl, and you know, it is heartbreaking, because it was just due to neglect. Like, you know, it was cot death. It could have happened to anyone, but also, yeah, it was a heartbreaking scene in both. But anyway, so you get, after the scene in the nightclub, you get the second scene that I can't watch, and Spud has realised that has soiled himself in the bed. Again, just thinking of that scene makes me feel a little bit sick. He tries to change the bedding. He ends up in like a mini fight with the mum, and the excretion goes everywhere. And now we're moving on. He ends up with no longer a girlfriend. So you get those two scenes. But then, we realise at this point as well, with Dawn passing away as a little baby, that Renton is back on the heroin. So anyway, in both as well, Spud goes for a job, so he can stay on the dole. He deliberately screws up the interview. In the book, it's mentioned that he's on speed. In the film, he just seems like a very energetic, sort of like over-the-top person anyway. Now, a small difference in the book is that Renton is flitting constantly between Scotland and London. This is not the case in the film. In the film, he's constantly in Scotland until he decides to get clean once and for all and ends up moving to London. Now, as well is in the book, Tommy does speed, but he refuses to touch heroin. However, in the film, he's completely clean. He doesn't do any kind of drugs. And again, we get the slow decline of Tommy because after his girl leaves him, he then ends up asking for one hit of heroin and then he ends up completely hooked. And his story is a very sad one, to be fair. So we end up with like a couple of chapters, as I said, that make absolutely no sense. Like one with about a poker game and then someone dying of a heart attack, and some money going missing in the book as well. But in the film at this point, we see the truly desperate measures that the boys are going to get money for heroin. So they're stealing, they're getting prescription drugs from doctors and selling them on. They're just basically trying everything and anything to get what they need. So as I said before, we see Renton and Begbie as well. Begbie sometimes joins Renton, going back and forth between London. Now, one thing I have noticed is that I'm not sure if it's my struggling to understand because of the prose of the book, but the timeline seems a little all over the place as each person has their own little narrative. So sometimes you're reading something and then suddenly you're like, oh, hang a minute, like what's just happened? Like, I don't understand what that is. But anyway, in both, Spud and Renton get caught shoplifting. Now, Spud gets sent down, but Renton gets off. We're going to sort of like a rehab, kind of, checking in and making sure he gets clean. So Renton and his family and friends his friends go to the pub to celebrate. Spud's mum causes a bit of a scene, but soon ends up leaving the pub. Then Renton hops the wall in the back of the pub and goes off to get a final hit of heroin. So, however, the last hit for Renton doesn't go as planned, as he ends up being dumped outside of a hospital and almost dying. This then causes his parents to come pick him up and basically lock him in his room to get clean once and for all. And it has a very sort of like, the scenes are pretty much exactly the same. He kind of sees the spectre of Dawn, the little baby that passed away. He sees his friends and family and everything like that kind of talking to him and taking the mick out of him. And this kind of does go down in the same way. So in the film, when he finally gets fully off the gear, he's completely gone. He realises that actually his life isn't that great. Like, his friends aren't really his friends. And so he decides he's finally off the gear and he's going to go down to London where he gets a job and a nice little flat. Now, another thing as well is in the book, he has two brothers. Now, one brother had a serious illness. He wasn't very well. He was considered disabled. He ended up going into a home and passing away. And the second brother, Billy, ends up joining the army and subsequently dies while out in Northern Ireland. But in the film, it's his only child. So, at Billy's funeral, you see Spud clean from H after being released from jail, but Tommy looking like death from being on heroin all this time. But then at the because in the film, you kind of get this idea that, yes, Renton's on heroin and stuff like that, but he's a kind of decent guy. In the book, you see sort of like he's a lot more flawed than they let on in the film, because at his dead brother's wake, he has relations with his dead brother's pregnant girlfriend. It was very explicit. I'm not going to go into any detail, but yeah, so that happened. But yeah, so in the film, Renton has made a little life for himself. Begbie ends up on the run and ends up sort of like camping out with Renton and messing everything up, basically. But also in the film, we learn of Tommy's death. Now, Tommy's death is a strange one, because in the book, it's someone completely different called Matty. In the film, Tommy, unfortunately, sort of like, took a lot of heroin, ends up being HIV positive, had like a mini heart attack, decided to get a kitten to try and like pull himself out of like a depression, ends up having a second heart attack and dies. This is the story of Matty in the book. This is exactly how he dies. In the film, they've changed it to Tommy. In the book as well, I've noticed is we get a lot more about HIV meetings. We get a lot sort of like the grungier side of the drug scene, both in Scotland and London. We're getting sort of like there's a scene where Renton has an old man come on to him in a cinema, and you know, it's just it's sort of like a lot more explicit, and it's a lot more, I don't want to say deranged, that's not the right word, but it's a lot more heartfelt as well. Like, you kind of like you feel for these characters, because you think, you know, and they even explain, if you're not on drugs, you can't really do anything with your life, because that's what you're expected to do. And you get that a lot more in the book than you do in the film. But in the film at this point, Sick Boy has come into some drugs that he's intending to sell in London, and needs Begbie, Renton and Spud to help him. So in the film, they manage to sell the drugs, and they end up with a fair whack of cash between the four of them. In the book, they get one load of cash from a robbery, it sounds like, but it's also just Begbie and Spud at this point, and some lad. And then later on in the book, you know, you do get sort of like the selling of the drugs from Spud and Begbie and Renton and Sick Boy as they travel down to London. They've also got another guy with them called Second Chance or Second Prize. Second Prize, that's it. Anyway, so in the film, they're sort of, the four of them are sat in a pub in London after they've made the deal and they've got the cash. And as they're talking about the cash, Begbie ends up in a full-on bar fight, absolutely, because this guy accidentally knocks into him, and like Begbie completely like glasses him. And that's when you see Renton realise that actually he has to cut his friends out of his life, and really get away to start clean, because otherwise he's going to constantly be on the same sort of like circle, basically. And so in this respect, like, the book and the film end pretty much exactly the same way. It ends with Renton taking the money and leaving. Now we get an additional sort of scene where Begbie realises he's been stolen from, basically, and he like trashes the hotel room and ends up sort of like in prison because of it. And a slight difference as well is that Renton leaves some cash for Spud, because he really does feel for Spud and he actually quite likes Spud. So he leaves some cash for Spud so that Spud's not sort of like completely out of the equation. But he takes the money and runs. And that's basically how the film and the book ends. So the plot does differ quite a bit. You do get the story told from many perspectives in the book, and you get a lot of more insight into the nitty gritty of the drug scene and the alcohol scene as well. You get quite a lot of alcoholics in the book. It does end and begin pretty much the same way, and the film keeps in the habits and characteristics of the main characters as well, sort of like who was using, who wasn't. Obviously they killed off Tommy in the film but kept him alive in the book. Well, you know, in the book's the original. And obviously the film focuses primarily on Renton's view. So for plot, I find that it kind of gets I'd say a 6 out of 10. Now, overall, the setting, the subject matter is pretty much the same. You know, however, the narration is quite different. You even get a few more characters in the book that you don't really see in the film. Like Renton's brothers as well, they're never mentioned in the film. I can understand, though, it doesn't really add anything to the story that much. And I do feel like, as well, they do keep a lot of the characteristics, but Renton seems a lot more of a whole... I don't know if this counts as swearing, so I do apologise. In the film, in the book, than he does in the film. Like, in the film, he seems like just the generally sort of like laid back, nice guy. So overall, it gets a 5 out of 10 for me. Now, of course, this is my own opinion. It always is. If you agree or disagree with anything that I say, do leave it below in the comments. Drop me a message. Don't forget to click subscribe and like this video as well, so you're alerted whenever new videos go live. As well, as I said in the last couple of weeks' episodes, is if you are wanting to sort of like guest star, maybe when COVID has calmed down a little bit and you're actually, you know, allowed people outside of the house, do drop me a message with a film to book adaptation that you'd like to do, and I'm more than happy to accommodate. You know, just try and get a lot of people introduced and excited about books and film adaptations as well. But until then, just remember to always always keep it contento.